Hey everybody, Pete Frogs here, and today I'm going to show you how to make Sega Genesis music. Let's go. Now this video is long overdue because I originally wanted to make it when I reached 1,000 subscribers on my channel, and that was a couple of months back. But hey, I'm doing it now, better late than never, I guess, right? Before we get started, please like and subscribe to the channel, that really helps out. Also, my Genesis Remix album, Genesis Jams 2, recently dropped. There's going to be a link in the description if you want to check it out. Now, a few things to consider before we get into the technical details. This video is going to be about how to make Sega Genesis music within a DAW and not within a tracker. Now, I don't know enough about trackers to make a tutorial about them, but if you'd like to know more, I'm sure you'll find lots of videos on that subject. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Sega Genesis and what it can and cannot do in terms of sound. So the Sega Genesis has two sound chips actually. The first is the SN76489, which was the same sound chip used in the Sega Master System, and then the YM2612. The SN76489 has 4 channels, 3 square waves, and then 1 noise channel. The YM2612 has 6 channels, all of them are FM synthesis channels. They support stereo, meaning that sounds can be played back left or right or dead center. And the 6th channel can also play back 8-bit sound samples. By the way, if you're not familiar with FM synthesis, I'm going to include a video about it in the description. So to sum it up, with those 2 sound chips, we have in total 10 voices that can be playing at the same time. We have some stereo options, even though they're quite limited. And we also have the ability to play back samples, even though that is also quite limited. Now, if you listen to Sega Genesis music from back in the day, you'll notice that out of these two, the YM2612 is usually doing most of the heavy lifting. In fact, if you listen to some tracks in particular, you'll notice that some of them only use that one and don't use the SN76489 at all. One example of that would be Final Zone from Sonic the Hedgehog 1. But then when the SN76489 is used, it's usually in more of a supporting role. So what that means for us is that the iconic sound of the Sega Genesis is really tied to FM synthesis. So if you want to get close to that sound, you really need to use a synth that has some FM synthesis capabilities. Let's talk about some options. The first option would be any synth that you have lying around that can do FM. So if you have Logic, you have EFM1. If you have Ableton, you have Operator. Maybe you have Serum or Vital, and both of these can do FM, even though they're quite limited. Now these options are okay, you can get some good sounds out of them, but because these synths do FM in a different way from the way the YM2612 does it, it's going to be hard to get close to the Sega Genesis sound without knowing a lot about FM synthesis in the first place. Second option would be to use a dedicated FM synth. So something like Dext by Digital Suburban, which is free and is an emulation of the Yamaha DX7. By the way, the YM2612 that you have in the Sega Genesis is a toned down version of the DX7 sound chip. You also have FM8, that's great for that purpose. Now the really cool thing about both of these synths is that they support the SysEx format. The really cool thing is that some people online have converted Sega Genesis presets that they used on those games back then into SysEx files. And if you import them into Dext or FM8, then you have basically the exact same sounds that the composers used back then on the Sega Genesis. There's going to be a link in the description to a site where you can download these SysEx files. Another option is Super Audio Cart by Impact Soundworks. Now this one is a contact instrument that samples the original hardware, so the Sega Genesis, but also does a bunch of other retro video game consoles. Now this one, of course, because it's based on samples, sounds really authentic to the hardware, but then it has a couple of limitations based on it being a sample-based instrument and not a synthesizer. Finally, my option of choice is to use a synth that is an emulation of the YM2612 that you find inside of the Genesis. So the one I use for my own productions is called Chipsynth MD by Plogue. That's the one I'm going to be demoing for you during the rest of this video. All right, so here we are in Logic Pro, and I'm going to show you exactly how I do these Sega Genesis remixes. This is the project file for Fairy Fountain, my remix of that track from The Legend of Zelda. And let me just play a little bit of that track in case you haven't heard it before. Let me walk you through everything that we have going on in this track. First, we have a kick and snare. And for these, I'm using that VST I was telling you about, Chipsynth MD. And these drums are coming from Streets of Rage. And I'm going to show you in a second how you can get those exact drums to work within that VST. Next up, in terms of the drums, I have some noise hi-hats coming from that noise channel in the SN76489, and they sound like this. So as you can hear, it's all the same noise, but I'm changing the length and the envelope of that noise so that it sounds either like a hi-hat or more like a crash cymbal. Next up, we have a bass. Really nice, mellow, fretless sounding bass. This one is also inspired by a bass from Streets of Rage. Then we have the main lead / arpeggio. Then we have a pad. The pad has 3 different voices, and I'm using the same synth patch and just duplicating it so I have 3 instances to play the different notes. And finally, we have some square waves coming from the SN76489, and they sound like this. Extremely quiet in the mix. As I said before, they have more of a supporting role in this case. If I zoom in on the MIDI, one interesting thing that you'll note is that one of them is ever so slightly delayed. And if I open up the MIDI and go over to pitch bend, you'll see that I'm using some pitch bend, but it's very, very subtle. So it's just very slightly detuning that square wave compared to that other square wave. And when you add that in with the slight delay, it creates this chorusing effect that you can hear. And basically, if you want to create a chorusing effect in the Genesis, that is the only way you can do it. You need to use 2 channels. It's the same if you want to create a delay effect, because you don't have chorus or delay inside of the Sega Genesis, right? So if you want to create a delay, you would need 2 channels. You would have one main channel, and then you would have another channel for the delay that is the same sound, but quieter and then delayed in time. That being said, if you listen to Sega Genesis tracks, you will hear that composers actually do that exact thing quite often, and it sounds really good. Another interesting thing is that if you fast forward later on in the track, you can hear those same square waves, but here they're occupying more of a lead role. So here they're much louder, but I'm still using the same trick with having one slightly delayed and also using some pitch bend. Here it's more pronounced because I wanted to have more of that chorusing effect. Now let me show you how that synth works, the Chipsynth MD synth that I'm using for all of these sounds. Let me load an instance of that plugin here. So this is what it looks like. You have different tabs here. So you have A and B, with both of which are instances of that YM2612 emulation. So basically it's an FM synth with 4 operators. And you have different algorithms here so that you can change the way these operators interact with one another. When it's all the way at 7 here, they're not interacting with one another. It's just a bunch of sine waves stacked on top of one another, which would be great for like organ sounds, for example. And then you have different combinations. When you go towards the left here, you get algorithms where only one operator is routed directly to the output, and all the rest are modulators. And that would be better for the buzzy and distorted sounds that the Genesis is actually quite well known for. But for this track, I'm definitely not using this type of sound that much because it's a more mellow track. So we have A and B, both of which are instances of that emulation. Then if you go to stack, you can decide if you want to listen to A or B or both. And you can also even have multiple instances of A. So for example, you can have A plus A and have another instance of A an octave up to layer it on top of itself, for example. I usually don't do that much. I usually just use one instance. I just like to keep things simple, I guess. Also, what you can see here is that you also have access to that SN76489. You also have an emulation of that inside of this synth. So you have the square waves here, 3 square waves, and a noise channel here. So I'm also using the same VST for those square waves that I just showed you, and also for those noise hats. Then you have mod matrix, some step modulators, which you can use to, for example, modulate the pitch or the volume of your operators effects, which I never use. And finally, we have this VGM tab, which is super cool. To use it, you need some VGZ files, which I don't know much about it, but it is a file format that is used for music files. I think it's basically a way to store maybe MIDI or preset information inside of a file format. So as you can see here on my hard drive, I have a bunch of folders for different Sega Genesis OSTs, and they're full of these VGZ files. Now if I select one, let's go to Sonic the Hedgehog and Green Hill Zone. Immediately track starts playing, and what's really cool is that if I go over here, you can see that this represents the different channels in the YM2612 and the SN76489. So if I want, I can listen to these in isolation by soloing or muting them. And that in and of itself is already quite cool, but the best feature of this is that if you use these copy A and B buttons here at the bottom, Basically, you can get the synth to recreate any synth patch that they're using in the original track. Let me show you an example with that bell sound that you hear at the start of Green Hill Zone. So I just hit copy A, and now if I press some notes on my MIDI keyboard, I have the same sounds being recreated inside of the VST, which is awesome. And that's what I did to get this bell sound, this main bell sound that I use in the remix. I used that one as a starting point, but then I messed around with some of the parameters. So you can change the envelope settings, you can change the mult, which basically controls the relative frequency of the different operators. You can also change the volume of the different operators. So let me open the final patch that I ended up with, and we can look at them both side by side. So as you can see, they look quite similar. I just took down the feedback here, changed some of the envelope settings and the volume of some of the operators. And let's just do a side-by-side comparison. So that one is the Green Hill Zone bell. And this is what I ended up with. Yeah, I thought that worked just better for this track in particular. And yeah, this is basically how I approach it. This is how I do all of my remixes. I copy a lot of these sounds from the original games, and usually I would modify them a bit. And also you don't see it because this project has been cleaned up quite a bit. But when I start a track, I start with a template that has a bunch of tracks. So I have a bunch of instances of that plugin with different patches already loaded in. And so when I do a remix, I bring in a MIDI file where I figure out the notes myself. And I basically addition different melodies or different MIDI patterns with the sounds that I have. So for example, how does this main melody sound when it's played back by that main lead from Chemical Plant Zone? Or how does that bass line sound when it's played back by the bass line from Streets of Rage or Shinobi 3? The main games that I take inspiration from are all of the Sonic games, Streets of Rage games, and Shinobi games, also a little bit of Michael Jackson's Moonwalker as well, and I guess maybe The Lion King in some places. Now let's look at the drums to close things out. I'm using Chipsynth MD as well for these. So the cool thing is that if you go over to the VGM tab, you can see I have channel 6 already soloed here, because this is where the samples will go. And if you click copy A and B for this track, it will actually import the samples that they used in the track, and then they will show up in this DAC tab. And then what you want to do is you want to go to stack and turn on DAC, and then probably turn off the rest if you don't want to hear some FM synthesis sounds on top of the drums. And you have the kick over here and the snare over here. And I'm basically using the same instance of the synth. I just duplicated it for the kick and snare. If I open up the MIDI, you can see that I have the kick on A sharp and snare on B. That's pretty much it for this video. I hope it was informative and that it helped you understand how I do my Sega Genesis remixes, and maybe that it motivated you to give it a try yourself. If you have any questions about any of this, feel free to leave a comment below the video, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.